Sanbonani Dumelang, good evening and welcome to the Monday edition of the Private Property Podcast. I'm your host, Uzamantungwa Khumalo. It's episode 205 of the Private Property Podcast. And if you're joining us for the first time, well, where have you been? You've certainly missed out on quite a lot of great content that we have brought to your screens. So do make sure that you go to our Facebook as well as YouTube page to catch up on some of the great episodes that we have already had on. And to all our regular viewers, welcome back to the Private Property Podcast. You know how we do it. Every single weekday at 7 p.m., myself, Zamantungwa Khumalo, and the rest of the team bring you a hot property topic that we tackle that helps us better understand property as an asset class. And it doesn't matter whether you are a renter, a landlord, you're looking to buy, you're looking to sell, perhaps you're even looking to build. This certainly is the show to cater, that certainly caters to all of your property needs. And one of the other things that we love priding ourselves in, of course, is the other host of other incredible shows that we have across the private property social media platforms. I am talking about the Farming Podcast that comes to your screens every Tuesdays and Thursdays at 8 p.m. Umbalino God brings you that edition. So to all of you at home who've got green fingers and want to explore all things agriculture, the Farming Podcast is the show you do not want to miss out on. And to all our first-time home buyers, well, SC Clarkson has you covered. So if you still have any reservations about what you can expect, what kinds of mistakes you should be avoiding, then make sure that you tune into the First Time Home Buyers show every Wednesdays at 8 p.m. And over the weekend, we never leave you alone. Chad brings you the Home Shoppers Show, where he gives you a sneak peek into some of the best estates and complexes that this country has on offer. But we certainly do have a lot on offer for you here at Private Property. And one of the things that we absolutely love offering is, of course, great competitions and incredible giveaways. And to kickstart 2021, we have certainly launched a great hunt that is the Sherlock Holmes competition, where we are asking you to crack a riddle every single week. And all you have to do that is to go into our website on www.privateproperty.co.za and crack the riddle and let us know where the riddle takes you. And in the event where you are a winner, you get to walk away with 5,000 Rand voucher every single Friday. And to keep things spicy, because 12 weeks is a long time and only 12 winners, maybe that's not quite the right number. So we want to make the winner's circle as big as possible. So every Wednesdays and Thursdays, we also have a spot prize of 500 Rand in cash. And all you have to do in order to potentially win that is you have to be watching us live. And if we call your name, then you have to drop us a text down here below live. Otherwise, we roll it over to the next person. It is that easy to walk away with cash on the Sherlock Holmes competition. And we're now on week 6. And the riddle for week 6 is one that I know a lot of Durbanites are absolutely going to love. And that is in the northern part of Durban, in the middle of 10 and 20 bars, you'll find a house in 3 dimension with a pool your pets will love. And that is the riddle for the 6th week of our Sherlock Holmes competition. We're halfway into this great competition. We're going to have it for 6 more weeks. So if you haven't entered yet, well, this is your opportunity to do just that. Do make sure that you also keep in touch with us across our social media platforms on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook, as well as on YouTube. You can also follow myself at Zamantungwa_K on Twitter, as well as on Instagram, where I also post incredible content on all things relating to property. Now, one of the things I'm quite excited about with this evening's conversation is that we've been talking a lot about how, this is currently a buyer's market and there's so many various opportunities that potential buyers can take advantage of. Sometimes even property investors can take advantage of where the market is because of the historically low interest rates and really also your ability to sort of bullishly negotiate a price even further down. But the reality of that also means that if you're a landlord, there might be tenants who now want to move from being a tenant to essentially being a homeowner. And that's precisely why this evening we're looking at tenants of becoming owners. What exactly does this mean for landlords? And to help us better understand what this may mean for landlords and some of the opportunities that this actually presents, as opposed to it being, a negative sentiment, I'm joined by somebody who needs no introduction to the Private Property Podcast team. That is, of course, Grant Smee, who's a director at Epic South Africa. Grant, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Nizama. Thanks for having me.
Grant, I think one of the big things with this is we were bound to have this conversation, right? Because when you think about how, certainly when we look at from, let's say, June-ish last year, maybe even slightly earlier, we're talking about the different opportunities that we're going to be seeing in the property space because of the historically low interest rates, and they kept going down. And we kept saying to people, this is how you can navigate buying that first property. But it also, of course, meant that certain tenants who previously probably could not afford to access the property market are now reviewing their finances, seeing how much they're paying for rent and how much they would potentially pay for running their own household that they essentially would own, and are thinking, this is probably the best time to make that switch from being a tenant to also being an owner. And this does present, I think, an opportunity as opposed to necessarily a negative thing for landlords. I think, firstly, how should landlords be thinking about this? Because I know of a few landlords who've already found themselves in this situation. I know there are probably going to be a few more this year who are going to potentially find themselves in that situation.
So I think, obviously landlords at the moment are under massive pressure from a price perspective because tenants are able to move into properties that potentially would cost the same or even less from an ownership point of view. Obviously, that excludes the rates and the levies that come with ownership, but tenants are making an active move towards buying an asset and owning their own home. And to a large degree because not only the historically low interest rates, but also that I think there's a generation of people who have missed the opportunity to buy into assets. And what the pandemic and the lockdown have done is make people realize what the value of having an asset in the name is. So there's this double-edged sword at the moment, movement into buying an asset as well as the cost of owning that asset is a lot lower than it previously has been. What that does for landlords, obviously, is downward pressure on rentals that they can ask. But obviously, their costs are a lot lower because the mortgages are much lower. So how should a landlord be thinking? They need to be much more creative in terms of their structuring, much more flexible in terms of their lease terms, their deposit requirements, the types of tenants they're willing to take, and even consider looking at taking multiple tenants for a single property to offset their risk, but also ensure that they have people in place paying rent. Because, again, the most expensive thing for a landlord in terms of the ownership of their property is an empty property.
Mm-hmm. And I think, one of the things that you also just have to weigh up, Grant, is in as much as an empty property is very expensive, we've spoken about this quite a lot, is that the wrong tenant placed in your property is also very expensive. So sometimes it may be worth you not collecting rent for 2 months just to get the right tenant who's going to stay the full sort of term and pay on time every month, as opposed to getting a tenant who is going to pay for those first 2 or 3 months, and then they're in your property and don't pay for the rest of the term. So I think with landlords, you also need to not get to the point where you're desperate and have those proactive conversations with your tenants, especially when you can see that their lease is, probably coming to an end. Are they going to renew their lease, or are they going to move to a different place? And in the event where they want to move to a different place, essentially try and find out, is it because of the price point, or is it because they actually just want to live in a completely different place? Because I think sometimes, Grant, as landlords, we're not as proactive in finding those details out from our tenants. You kind of then must find a new tenant, whereas sometimes tenants would have been more than happy to stay, perhaps in this period, if they were to be offered even a 5% reduction on the rental. That would have probably been, let's assume, for example, that was a very great tenant who had been paying on time every time. They found a place in the same building that charges 500 Rand less. as a landlord, you might find that you can actually afford that 500 Rand reduction as opposed to having to source a new tenant or work with an agent to source that tenant, pay them the commission, and essentially, almost gamble on whether or not that's a good tenant.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're seeing a lot of landlords that are sort of stuck in two schools of thought. One is old school thinking that there must be an escalation every year, and that's absolutely not the case. In fact, like you said, there should be a decrease, and particularly for a good tenant. You're offsetting some of that risk because that tenant has been paying. And part two is that a lot of landlords aren't running this as a business. They're running this as as a sideline. They're desperate for the money. They haven't made provision for non-payment of rent, for maintenance, repairs that might come up. So they're actually desperate for the money, and that puts them into a desperate situation when the property is empty to maybe place a tenant that they shouldn't be. So prevention is better than cure. Doing your checks properly, making sure that you vetted the tenant properly, checking everything. I mean, we're seeing a high level of fake documentation coming through in terms of tenant applications at the moment. Fake bank statements, fake pay. And the problem is if you take it at face value, you're going to place a tenant that potentially couldn't even pay beyond month one, never mind the rest. So I would remain steadfast in the fact that you need to do double check and triple check the tenant's credentials before you give them keys to your asset that's worth hundreds of thousands, if not millions of rands.
Grant, actually I wasn't aware that we're seeing a surge of, tenants placing fake documents. I think it's alarming. It also just speaks to the stage of, we'll say, economic affairs that we're finding ourselves in, that on the one hand, you also have tenants that are very desperate for accommodation, that they would go to the extreme of, submitting fake documents. And that's where, as a landlord, doing your checks and your due diligence becomes so important. And even in instances where you work with an agency that does the vetting for you, make sure that they're not cutting corners, because you sometimes find that agencies want to cut corners because they know that they get their, that commission up front as opposed to at the end of the lease term. So it becomes, as important as a landlord to just make sure that you have your finger on the pulse on the potential tenant that's about to be placed in your property.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned a good point there. Expecting the agency to do all the checks when they're commission driven, and agents might take shortcuts to try and make sure that they earn the commission, because again, the rental market in particular isn't one that's particularly active across the board. So they are under more pressure to try and close deals to get commission. That's where they earn their money. So there is high potential that some agencies might cut corners, and a landlord can't just ignore that fact and also pass that responsibility onto the agent. They must double check. So ask to check for look at the credit checks, ask to look at the bank statements, ask to look at any other information provided by the tenant. The agency does need to ask the tenant for their permission, but that should be in the initial agreement with the tenant when they apply, that you can see the information from a landlord point of view. But double check the agency, absolutely.
Grant, earlier on in our conversation, you highlighted how right now, given that tenants are also becoming owners, one of the things that landlords need to do is that they need to be creative in terms of how they structure, we'll say, their portfolio. What does it essentially mean when we talk about creative ways of structuring your portfolio? Because I'm sure some landlords don't quite have a sense of how to be creative when it comes to dealing with their rental properties.
Yeah, so if we go back to the old school of thought, a 12-month lease with a double deposit in some areas, 1.5 deposit in others, with a rental escalation included in your lease. I think what landlords need to do, if you look at the traditional buy-to-let model, is at least be more flexible in your lease terms. So don't expect a 2-month notice period, ask for a 1-month notice period, which is aligned with Consumer Protection Act in the first instance. Second one is maybe look for a slightly lower deposit, although I would never suggest anything lower than 1 month. And the last thing is maybe look at a 6-month lease term instead of a 12-month. That's slightly less commitment on a tenant's part and gives them a little bit more flexibility that they might not get elsewhere. So just being, I think, a bit more flexible in terms of the terms you have is vitally important. But also what you need to start considering is you need to add value to a tenant, particularly in the sectional title space. If there's 10 units going for the same price in your complex, what can you do to attract the tenants and the good tenants that are there? So you could potentially offer the unit at flexible lease terms, slightly lower rent, maybe include Wi-Fi as an example. So there are a few things that you can do to try and make your unit more attractive than other competing properties in the same space.
I'm this evening talking to Grant Smee, who's a director at Epic South Africa, and we're talking about how tenants are increasingly becoming homeowners and what this exactly means for landlords. If you're currently a landlord and you've already encountered this particular situation where your tenant has decided to move from tenant to homeowner, do share your experiences with us. So I certainly want to hear from you. And I also want to find out from the different landlords if they're finding creative ways to retain their tenants, and what are some of those creative ways to retain tenants, because sometimes it may not be that you will lose your tenant because they're now becoming a homeowner, but it may be that you're losing a tenant because they found accommodation in the same building that has the same sort of amenities and features of the property in the same complex for a less amount. So are you proactive in how you're engaging with your particular tenants, and how are you going about being as proactive as possible? And from the tenants, I want to hear from you. Have you gone from renting to owning? How has that experience been like? Have you been able to take advantage of these historically low interest rates? And were you able to have a conversation with your landlord if you weren't, for example, buying but wanted to move apartments? Were you able to sort of reach middle ground with them, perhaps reducing their rental in order for you to still remain a tenant in their property? Do share your experience with us down here below. We absolutely love hearing from you. I see we've got comments from some of the top fan gang members on Facebook. Ubong Sabakwena saying, never pay an agency up front. They get paid when you get paid. So pay monthly so they have interest in collecting the rental every month. And I think, with that one, Bongs, I was specifically referring to how often when you work with an agency, you can opt to pay for the placement, or you can opt to pay for the placement as well as the, we'll say, the management of that tenant. Typically, the placement you would sort of pay up front, and then that month-to-month payment, they would then take it from the rental collection. I haven't heard of a setup where when they do the placement, you're able to pay them almost the fraction of that placement on a month-to-month basis. Grant, have you heard of that one? I typically haven't. When I've worked with agencies where they did a placement, that, and would typically be 1 month's rental, would be relatively upfront. Then the other would be a percentage, whether it's 6 to 10% that they would charge for the month-to-month rental collection.
Yeah, I think the traditional model is paying a agency upfront for the work they've done, which is procuring a tenant. By trying to pay them on a monthly basis in terms of that actually tenant finding, you're trying to again palm off responsibility as a landlord and palm off the responsibility of the tenant to actually pay for their rental. So when a tenant and landlord enter this contractual arrangement, that agent isn't party to that, and you can't really bind them to that through their commission. So I think it would be, you might find agencies are willing to do it. I suggest that you might find agencies that are doing other things to earn revenue, because you're actually cutting the lifeblood of their business off by trying to tie them into guaranteeing that you're going to receive your rent. So it's not a structure that I've heard in sort of agencies that really do provide a good level.
Another question, this one coming from Khubudi Pilusi, who says, we shouldn't charge rent based on our lifestyle changes. The tenant shouldn't be disadvantaged because the insurance on the property went up. Landlords can be creative and search for more affordable insurance instead. And perhaps, Grant, if you can comment on that one, because I think and I'll speak primarily sort of pre-COVID, we did see a lot of landlords almost charging rental based on their own respective lifestyles and not necessarily, I'll say, market-related rentals. And in some markets, I'd say they were getting away with it because there wasn't as much stock on the market. But obviously, in the sort of the past couple of years, we've seen quite a lot of rental stock, especially in the major metros. So you've kind of had to adjust what you're charging slightly. But now, of course, with sort of the effects of COVID and also an oversupply of rental stock is not a guarantee.